everyone.
Yeah, I do a lot of.
Welcome. Welcome today to this Spring 2018 on the Harvard Law School Library's first faculty book talk for the spring semester. And today I'd like to introduce the book that we're talking about, recently published by Columbia University Press. This talk is in honor of the law and the wealth of nations, finance, prosperity, and democracy. I would also like to add to that today's talk is being held in honor and in memory of this book's author, Tamara Lothian. Joining us today as commentator, to my left, is Professor Duncan Kennedy, who is Carter Professor of General Jurisprudence, Emeritus from Harvard Law School. And also joining today's panel we have special guests visiting us, Mark Berenberg, who is the Isidore and Seville Sulzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia University School of Law, Robert Hackett, who is the Edward Cornell Professor of Law from Cornell Law School, and Sanjay Reddy, who is Associate Professor of Economics at the New School for Social Research. And finally, Professor Christine Desan, who is Leo Gottlieb Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, and with special thanks today to Professor Desan for her role in organizing today's talk. Let's give. Okay. Before we get started, I have just two reminders. Okay, we are going to have books on sale today from the Harvard Law School Coop. The books have not arrived at the law school yet. They are on schedule for delivery. They were scheduled for delivery this morning. They will be here, hopefully by the end of today's talk, and will be on sale right outside the door here. And secondly, I'd like to remind you all that today's talk will be recorded and will be available to you, particularly for folks who have to leave or can't be here for the entire talk, on the law school's YouTube channel approximately 2 weeks after today's event. So thank you, and now I will turn the microphone over to Professor Kennedy.
So welcome to this event. It's great to see this turnout. Both Tammy and the book fully deserve to be celebrated in this way, and it really makes me feel great to see you all here. So my role is to be the warm-up, so I'm not going to talk except briefly at the end about the book. I'm going to talk about what Tammy was like during the time when I knew her well, which was when she was a law student and shortly thereafter. I knew her quite well, and I just want to give you some sense of what she seemed to me to be like, a very, very subjective way of approaching it, because maybe she would have said she wasn't like that at all. And she might well have, because a first characteristic of Tammy was that she was disrespectful and highly ironic. So there were different ways to be disrespectful. This was a period of a crisis of legitimacy for Harvard Law School. So the whole school, the faculty, and the whole student body were caught in a moment in which the legitimacy of the school was challenged from the left. And Tammy was completely part of that. In that thing, many people were disrespectful and furious. So disrespect flowed in all directions, from the old people to the young people, among the young people, among the old people. Tammy was more not respectful. She wasn't disrespectful in the sense of being pissed off. Her basic attitude was, you don't deserve any respect until we see what you're like, would be something like that. And that was a great relief, but it was also a kind of balm in the situation of increasing tension. So she was really just unwilling to give anybody credit unless they deserved it. And that's also, this was a situation where everyone is respecting someone intensely. So all the camps have their internal hierarchies where the people who are on top are being earnestly followed and stared at and respected by people in their faction, and earnestly disrespected intensely from people from the other factions. So non-respect was an amazingly powerful attitude combined with irony. So her basic attitude was almost everybody in some way is oddly quirky, a little contradictory, not really to be taken as seriously as they want to be taken. Very, very appealing in the context. Second trait would be this. So Tammy was interested in what's going on in a way that was one step removed from the experience of the participants. So in these struggles over the legitimacy of the institution, people are very wound up, and the question of what's going on is the question of what's happening to their own approach or point of view. But Tammy had that, But she was completely interested in and capable of stepping back and saying, well, wait a minute, what's really going on here? The superficial battle doesn't tell us all we need to know. So I first had this, she was in my torts class. She was a fantastic student of the law of torts. I mean, just an amazingly good student. She was an A+ student in the strongest possible sense of the word. But she was perfectly capable at the end of the class, I would say, Tammy, what was going on? And she was said, the women were furious at you. Now, this was just not the usual way for students to talk to the professor about what was going on in the class. Or she might say, that gunner has reached almost the end of his string, and he will be lynched. You wait, you'll see he's going to be lynched. So this is a sense that there's a bigger context of play, gamesmanship, and rivalry within which everyone is operating. She also had that attitude towards the faculty. So one more anecdote of this particular attitude would be this. An important moment, I think, in Tammy's life was when she came to my office. She made an appointment with me, which she didn't usually do. She just came to my office hours. And she came to made this appointment. She said, I want to ask you a question. What do you think of Mr. Unger? So literally the words were, and the tone, I tried to imitate the tone, Mr. Unger. So the tone was very complicated. It has this message which was on two levels. One message is, he's just Mr. Unger. I mean, he's just another guy, so everyone thinks he's such a big deal. So what do you think of Mr. Unger? I could cut him down to size in 2 minutes. That was the underlying thing. And the other was, Mr. Unger evoked for me, how true is this? A Jane Austen novel, Mr. Unger, Mr. Darcy, maybe I was Mr. Bennet, the patriarchal figure who was trying to preside over the marriages and non-marriages of all the people in the system. So that was an amazing Tammy move. It was immediately apparent that this was a very significant conversation. So I said, Roberto is absolutely wonderful. He's a great guy. I think he would be a fantastic life partner. I didn't say that. So anyway, now, how is this connected to the book? So it is connected to the book in the following way. One of the oddities of the book, which would not have been the case if Tammy had finished it, I'm sure, and I don't think Roberto could very well have really intervened on this dimension of it. A very striking aspect of the book is it refers in 3 different occasions to say the most important thing about the book. No, one of the key ideas of the book is to develop the idea that within private law theory, there is a tradition of critique of the idea that the market is given its canonical or correct form by the conceptual development of the ideas of property and contract and tort. So this idea recurs and recurs and recurs. The moment that Tammy was a student at Harvard Law School and the world she participated in was a moment when this idea, exactly as she says, as part of a very long, she calls it a 100-year-old tradition of thinking about law, was most prominently being developed by the faculty. And the people who were very involved in it, some of them were in this room, but not all. So on one level, Roberto and Morty Horowitz and myself very self-consciously understood ourselves to be part of a 100-year tradition. And Frank Michelman, who was sitting right here, was older than us, had been involved in this very precisely, exactly the same inquiry for his whole academic career, since the 60s when he began to write about the relationship with law. Jerry Frug had recently joined the faculty. Jerry Frug taught a whole course, the message in which there's no such thing as a free market, because all markets are heavily, in fact, understood as artifacts of different interpretations of contract and property and tort. But it's not just that. Tammy was part of a generation in which many of our students became professors. But I said many of our professors, I mean a lot. So there were already on the presence of this, the 4 assistant professors called the Shrimps, which included Claire Dalton, Governor Dan Tarullo, soon later to become a governor of the of the Fed and the architect of the Basel Accords, about to be fired from Harvard Law School summarily because he wrote an article critiquing the free trade doctrines being propagated by John Jackson, the leading trade theorist of the time. So this is legitimacy up in the air. So it's very important that Tammy is actually, in my mind, very much a product of this thrilling moment of the challenge of legitimacy. And the book really does develop that idea in a fascinating way by applying it to finance. So Law and the Wealth of the Nations is something that in this tradition had not been done before. I think there are now quite a few people working on it. She found a topic which, if she'd lived and been able to finish and develop it, would have put her at the center of a lot of law and development debates. Because finance interpreted in different ways is everywhere in the discussion, often in a way that could be said to reduce to economic growth is caused by innovation. Innovation is caused by finance. More finance, more innovation, therefore economic growth. The innovation mantra is everywhere, and her book is deeply, deeply subversive of and critical of this completely now ritualized appeal to innovation as everything. So I'm just about done with my time. What I want to say, to say she was an appealing character is really understating it. She was very funny. Her non-respect and irony were directed incredibly consistently at windbags and stuffed shirts. She was completely a devoted scholar at the same time that she was a lawyer, an activist, a consultant, and all the other things. And I feel that I'm very fortunate to have known her, and to have known her at this great time in the history of the law school and of her emerging self. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Duncan, and thanks for inviting me, Chris and Roberto. I'll jump into the book, but first I want to say that this chance to remember Tamara Lothian in this setting and to talk about her magnificent book among these people, it carries a lot of importance for me as a matter of intellect and feeling. When we were in law school, Tamara and I were classmates and friends. Then she taught law and finance as my colleague at Columbia. So our conversations and friendship continued for decades. At the center of the book is Tamara's vision for restructuring finance toward the ends of deep democracy in politics and in the market economy and radical freedom in individual lives. She wants a democracy through which people can quickly and capaciously reshape basic economic and social structures. And she wants a market that vastly increases opportunities and capabilities for ordinary people to enlarge their lives. She says the book doesn't offer comprehensive proposals for revolutionizing all of market capitalism, just finance. But in that disclaimer, I'd say she's being modest. Along the way, her program reaches from finance into many other big domains: the world trading system, the constitutional order, the structure of party politics, the shape of economic enterprise, of contract and property, of education, of immigration, of labor. In the time allotted, I'll comment only on what she has to say about the last of those, the tight connection between restructuring finance and the sphere of work. The book makes a far-reaching breakthrough on that subject, I believe. And it shows how steadfast and successful Tamara was throughout her life in searching for ways to enlarge the lives of working people. When we were law students, Tamara and I and a few others came together in the Harvard Labor Law Project. We hoped to think up radical reforms to attack the oppressiveness of wage labor of the sort that we saw in our time. There were some smart, creative people in that group, but Tamara's intellect and vision and fearlessness ran deepest. She jumped into combing foreign and international regimes, looking for institutional pieces that might be reconfigured to do the job. One of Tamara's very early published papers, shortly after law school, showed that her method and imagination could pay off. The paper's mission was to devise a labor regime that fulfills four big goals: worker emancipation, democracy within worker movements, continuous mobilization in politics of the working class, and overcoming or mitigating economic dualism across sectors of the economy. The paper begins by comparing the American labor regime and certain South American regimes. North American regimes are contractualist. Workers choose in decentralized work units whether they want unions. If they do vote to unionize, then they can select among multiple unions to be their representatives. Unions aren't arms of the ruling state or party, but unions, being decentralized and only partial in their coverage of the workforce, privilege workers in the organized sector and reinforce dualism in the economy. Other regimes in the Americas are corporatist. The state requires workers to join unions. There are state-designated unions that hold a monopoly on representation. The comprehensive coverage of the unions is a potential force for desegmentation of the economy and unification of the working class. And the state mobilizes workers in displays of populism that nonetheless incite workers to become an independent political force. So Tammy's prescription was to make a hybrid of the corporatist mandate that workers join comprehensive unions and the contractualist authorization of workers to choose among competing unions, not controlled by the state, to combine political activation of workers with democratic vitality in workers' movements. Decades have passed, but I still assign that wonderful paper every spring in my seminar on labor in the global economy. That paper's proposal resurfaces in Law and the Wealth of Nations. I suppose that's one reason why the book stirred a feeling in me of walking beside Tamara down her intellectual path since law school. In law school and her early writing, her intellectual practice enacted a tacit theory, but that germinated into the book's mature articulation of a complex way of thinking and a method to apply it. But as I said, the book's big programmatic breakthrough for labor has to do with the connection between finance and work. Her argument doesn't rest on the familiar progressive critique about the triangular nexus of high finance and corporate headquarters and stock markets. In that more familiar story, big banks and institutional funds squeeze CEOs to raise stock prices, and CEOs pander to the short-term mentality of the market by ordering mass layoffs or corporate restructuring in ways that can wreck whatever high-trust production systems had been painstakingly built by workers and local production managers, supported by an array of local public and private institutions. Tamara understands that pathology, but when she embeds the reconstruction of finance in her larger project of democratizing markets and extending individual freedom, she uncovers a different connection between finance and labor, lying right at the heart of what finance is supposed to do, and more revolutionary in its implications. The job of finance is to take savings and move them to production. It's not supposed to divert savings into speculation at several removes from the real economy. So at the core of Tamara's program is the design of institutions that tighten the relation between finance and production. And one goal of integrating finance and production is to quicken the pace of innovation and productivity growth. Another is to disseminate high knowledge, high trust forms of production from the lucky workforce in the vanguard of the economy to the rearguard sector of more precarious work. The so-called precariat suffers chaotic, uncertain employment, and when those precarious workers are employed, they suffer routinized and machine-like, deadening work tasks. A third goal is to tame financial instability and better synchronize growth in supply and demand. So Tamara wants finance to do those things: innovation, dissemination of high knowledge, production, more stable and balanced growth. But from the standpoint of the labor question, an even more profound goal is to emancipate workers from coercive wage labor, to enable them to live greater lives in a democratized market that's enormously richer in opportunities. Now, the proposition that wage labor is coercive might seem fishy to some of you. Our law says it's not. Wage labor is a taken for granted institution in market economies as we know them. But Tamara's way of thinking, like Roberto's, is to relentlessly question the necessity of social arrangements that constrict freedom. So what's the argument that wage labor is coercive, and why is it unnecessary? In its response to those questions, Law and the Wealth of Nations stands, at least implicitly, as a rebuke to a certain narrow vision that you find, oddly, in both conventional Marxism and in modern mainstream labor law. For traditional Marxism, it's inequality in the labor market that accounts for domination at work. The single secret to capitalist work is the fact that workers are propertyless, and to survive, they have to sell their labor power to capitalists. That's wage labor. That's the root of class domination, of the class struggle between labor and capital. That's the motor of history. Capitalism's an indivisible system of institutions ordained by that class structure, by the core institutions of wage labor and capitalist private ownership of the means of production. But after Marx, political economists of the 20th century on the left and right, from Weber to Schumpeter, Keynes, Polanyi, many, many others, made the case that capitalist wage labor can't be understood or explained unless you look beyond the immediate institutions of the labor market and private enterprise to a historical array of other institutions. You can't understand our market economy's particular constriction of freedom at work unless you look into the particular structure of product markets, of production systems, the monetary system, financial institutions, state structures that sustain financial and monetary systems, even the global system of rivalrous states that reassures against confiscation of private property, corporate property, along with the hegemonic states that stabilize international finance and money. As I said, modern mainstream labor law follows conventional Marxism in just the same narrow field of vision. Section 1 of the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 says what Karl Marx says: duress, coercion in the workplace is rooted in propertyless workers' need to sell their labor to owners of capital, in the asymmetric bargaining power between workers and capitalists in the labor market. So then regulation of labor markets and workplace institutions defined in that thin way takes care of all, or at least most, of what needs taking care of. So contemporary labor law it's a artificially depleted field. It's one of many instances of legal fields whose boundaries are just truce lines in power politics and an ideological struggle. The horizons of labor law today are essentially the boundaries of the social democratic and New Deal settlements after World War II. So labor law looks no further than regulation of employment contract, collective bargaining, and employment-related social insurance. And in the legal academy, those boundaries of labor law were hardened by professors in other fields protecting their turf. The same in labor economics, I believe. Some, but not many, professors of financial institutions or corporate law or constitutional politics or international relations want to be told, few of them want to be told, that workplace power is a core sub-object of their study. And labor lawyers and labor economists defer to that distaste, even though the institutions that preoccupy those other fields in all their historical particularity are absolutely key to what happens in our workplaces in all their historical particularity. But here's the point. Tamara's different. She's alert to the deep relation of particular financial institutions to particular institutions of wage labor. She proposes reconstructing financial institutions to radically enlarge the credit available to ordinary people and to create institutions to give them the technical, political, and educational support they need so they can escape the coercion of deadening wage labor by becoming their own masters, either in their own small businesses or in worker cooperatives or in other forms of collaborative work. So those are escape routes to uncoerced labor. But the opportunity for escape would also radically increase workers' bargaining power in the wage labor sector during the step-by-step transition to Tamara's new kind of market socialism. Just like in the 19th century, the possibility of escape to smallholding farming in the frontier enabled workers on the East Coast to bargain for the highest wages in the world. Of course, better wages aren't the touchstone of tomorrow's labor program. If the market's democratized in this way, if good opportunities proliferate for workers to be their own masters, they could lead bigger lives by widening the arena in which they exercise creativity and critical thought, for which a revolutionized educational system prepares them. So this program of market democratization, it converges on an important point made by Roberto in one of his great books, his many great books, Democracy Realized, which I know Tamara admired very much. Conventional thinking on the left sees small business, the petty bourgeoisie, as inevitably adversarial toward wage laborers. Roberto encouraged the left to reimagine those two classes as allies. Tamara's book is the fullest account we have of how financial restructuring could help align those class interests. The right financial institutions would enable each class to empower the others. So far, I've talked only about the book's program. It has a second equally ambitious project proposing a new way of thinking about institutional transformation and a method for applying that way of thinking. Neither the right nor the left has yet come up with a convincing theory of institutional transformation. And the book overflows with original insights into that project. It's a masterwork in social theory. In the time I have, I'll just mention how the labor question illustrates Tamara's way of thinking and method. So she marches under the banner, structure, not system. Existing institutions are a hodgepodge. They're the historical product of political and intellectual conflicts with political and ideological settlements expressed through law. They don't lock together in a predestined combination, a system. But they are a structure, meaning they are resistant to change. So institutional imagination needs to search for points of leverage in a resistant structure. The search is informed by what Tamara calls fragmentary theory. That means rummaging the existing fields of political economy and law for useful tools. She thinks it's premature for the left to pronounce a new full-blown system of thought of the sort that corresponded with the predefined social systems of 19th century social theorists. And in just the same way, it means sifting institutional elements from the past and from foreign regimes and imagining institutions possibly adjacent to the resistant structure before us. And institutional transformation, revolutionary change, it happens in the same fragmentary way. We want to imagine radical reforms that head incrementally in the direction of deep democracy and heightened freedom, starting from where we are. Okay, so Tamara's link between finance and work is a good example. It offers a wedge into the institutional structure of coercive labor in the way I've described. Tamara exploits that wedge by thinking of institutions that combine elements from contractualist and corporatist labor regimes, from cooperative movements of the post-Civil War era, labor republicanism, that is, from community banking institutions implanted in the Jacksonian years, from agricultural extension programs and land-grant colleges of the 19th century, from the New Deal's government-sponsored enterprises, from contemporary venture capitalism. Those fragments haven't been at the center of progressive thinking about finance, at least until after the 2008 crisis, when some progressive theorists emphasized, rediscovered some of those fragments: community banking, municipal banking, post office banking. But Tamara's the first to situate those, along with many other pieces, in a comprehensive program for reconstructing finance, connected to overcoming labor coercion and economic dualism, and guided by the revolutionary goals of democratizing market institutions, deepening political democracy in a way that enables us collectively to reshape our political economy, and empowering individuals to live more freely. So the book says it hasn't yet arrived at a systematic social theory, and it looks ahead to collaborative work, conversations among intellectuals, left intellectuals who engage in its ideas. But I think Tamara, again, speaks modestly about the book's contribution. I think she's taken us quite a long distance down the path to a highly ramified, original framework of thinking. What a terrible loss that she's not here to continue the conversation with us. Her ideas live. I hope her exemplary fearlessness lives in some of us. Thank you.
So Mark gives me a great place to start. I would agree that Tammy Lothian's book is a manifesto. Tammy writes with fury. She has set her sights on the catastrophic failure of finance to deliver on its promise to make capital productive. So how is it possible, she would ask, that each day more than 700 billion changes hands on the bond markets, total annual trading there of 175 trillion in 2015, and yet at the same time, the vast bulk of most firms' productive investment comes from their retained earnings, right? How is it possible that they're using their retained earnings when what is all that activity on the bond market doing? How is it possible at the same time that we have 175 trillion passing hands, passing between people, the total annual savings of the American public is a scant 3 trillion? There's a disconnect here. How is it possible that at the same time, 30 to 50% of the American public is unbanked, unable to get the services of the financial industry? Her point is that there's a disconnect between finance and the real economy. And her tone is rousing, liberatory, evocative. There's one great sentence after another in this book. You really have to pick it up. She aims to disturb us and to mobilize us. But her book is also a manifesto in a deeper sense. So I mean literally manifesto from the Latin, to make apparent, palpable, visible, to bring into view, to make public. The book maps finance as something that is cognizable and something that's open to our understanding, something that we can talk about publicly, that we can make democratic, that we can democratize. So the point of the book is to claim finance, not to abandon it. Finance is at the core of modern capitalism, and as she says kind of modestly at one point, if we can reclaim finance, then maybe we can reclaim capitalism, right? If we can redirect the power and capacity of finance to productive aims, it would be a huge accomplishment. And just as important, it would break the hold that modes of thinking about finance and thinking about the economy have on us conceptually, which are enormously powerful kind of categories of our thought. So today I want to talk briefly about Tammy's approach. Mark has actually set it out so well. I will say very little, that elaborates on what he said. And then I want to apply it, to kind of give it a test run, so to speak. So Tammy's approach is twofold, as you could already, as Mark has suggested. First, there's critique, and then there's programmatic reconstruction. So critique, the orthodoxy is wrong. That includes the neoclassical orthodoxy for Tammy, the Marxist orthodoxy, the liberal progressive regulatory orthodoxy. How can we know? She would say we use law and history to expose the places where they've gone wrong, right, to contest their assertions. So for example, neoclassical economics supposes that the market will allocate resources to their most efficient uses insofar as there aren't market failures. But this view, she would say, assumes a constancy of institutional and legal content of the market. And as Duncan first set out and Mark elaborated, there is no such constancy of the market. So the market has been rebuilt, re-elaborated time and again, reconstructed by politically diverse means to institutionally divergent ends. So we can't actually make a sweeping generalization about the efficiency of the market without knowing all those terms. And that includes these rebuilt institutions, include banks, capital market, financial entities. They've all worked different ways over different times. Another example, the progressive regulatory orthodoxy assumes that it must simply cure the regulatory failures of the market, but this view ordains a prehistoric market whose failure we're curing, and in this moment, she says, it reinforces the neoclassical model. So critique is essential in her view. Second step is programmatic reconception. The goal is to connect finance to the real economy, and Mark really laid this out wonderfully. If we built the institutions of the market, including labor and wage labor, we can rebuild them, is her contention. And her focus is in particular on the speculative activity of finance. She shares this focus with Keynes, who was very concerned with the kind of self-referential nature of financial trading. That activity, some significant portion of the $175 trillion that I spoke about at the outset, creates significant dangers. So for one, it destabilizes the market. We've all lived through. This is a generation that knows the financial instability because of the financial crisis. It also channels wealth away from the productive to the speculators, so away from the hands and projects of producers. And this brings me to a related programmatic point. So Tammy's larger goal is to democratize the market. She wants us to return finance to the service of smaller producers and consumers. And her invitation, her promise is that we can direct it to those agents if we redesign the channels through which it's flowing. So that's the basic challenge. We might, for example, make options and hedges. She has all these ideas. So if you want ideas, just dip into the book anywhere, right? We could make options and hedges available to the small farmer, not the commodities trader. We can reimagine securitization, opening up opportunities, say, for green technology. Okay, so now I want to apply this approach, both the critique and the programmatic reconstruction. Critique is a huge job, and Tammy doesn't expect that just by saying institutions exist and they change convinces people of their mutability or of our political ability to change them. An example I take from my own work: money is an institution, it's changed over time. Many people recognize that. Many of the same people have created models that deeply naturalize the institution and its changes. So I'll try a few on you. You've all heard this. Money is a commodity, like gold or a basket of goods or Bitcoin, right? It's just a commodity. And in fact, in that very example, you hear the evolution, right? We've gone from gold to a basket of commodities to Bitcoin to the virtual. So we've changed. Or, money's a social agreement, like to use an inch or an ounce. So Tammy would tell us, go to law and see what money actually is. I was just doing this in class. The answer is neither, right? Money is neither a commodity nor a convention. And Tammy would say, use the law, bring the artillery of law to the critique, and make it real. So money, the very medium of finance, is legally defined by statute and by the Supreme Court. What is money? It's a sovereign liability. This is about the US dollar I'm speaking. I just did this, as I said, in class. It's, according to Title 12, USC 411, a sovereign debt, something the US will take for value in taxes. Part 2, it has cash properties. It's a sovereign debt that can change hands, that is enhanced, and its value is enhanced by that property. So what difference does that kind of definitional, that sort of the legal grip, make? If money is a sovereign debt with cash properties given by the government, if we can nail that down and see its legal definition, we know that it's not something naturally occurring outside of law. In fact, it's not a commodity spontaneously chosen by people without law. It's not a convention on which people converge socially as opposed to legally or politically. Moreover, if money is a sovereign debt, we can consider the myriad ways that the government can structure sovereign debt and can restructure sovereign debt, and has done those things. So we can actually look at the nitty-gritty. And Tammy, I believe, would say, yes, let's see how the US has structured money and law, and let's see if we can make those structures more democratic. So now I get to the programmatic part. So part 2 of the application of her thought. How does the US structure money and law? The US has an instrument of choice for money creation. The instrument of choice for money creation is banks, right? There are 2 kinds of banks. A central bank, it's in the business of creating little pieces of sovereign debt called dollars. So every time the Fed buys a longer-term debt, it pays in shorter-term dollars, right? So it's just taking longer-term debt and atomizing it into dollars. And those dollars land in the accounts of commercial banks. So that brings us to the second kind of bank that is an instrument of choice in the US. The central bank is at the center of this payment system, a huge clearinghouse. It is the clearinghouse for all these banks who are using these little atomized pieces of debt, and they multiply them through their own representations of credit. That's what all those deposits are. So the whole system, the whole monetary system, is something we've made through law, we're publicly supporting as an institution, and we can remake. So Tammy points in particular to the democratic potential of local banks. In the 19th century, banks democratized credit to access to credit. They're often actually working with state-created debt, in that case, not federally created debt, but they're working with debt. They spread money through urban and rural areas. Early on, they often worked directly at the behest of legislatures who are chartering them to go do a certain kind of project or lending. Today, the industry is much more consolidated. So specifically, the 6 largest banks hold 67% of all the assets in the financial system, as compared to 37% 5 years ago, right? So that amount of consolidation. The 4 largest banks control 50% of all bank assets. So Tammy points us to that kind of change and suggests that we revitalize local banks, right? We should make them the leaders and make lending responsive to local needs. So I want to go the direction that Tammy's inviting us to go on banking and suggest one possibility. I'm going to actually pick up the postal banking example that Mark mentioned. 19th century banks, the banks that Tammy's using as an inspiration, these kind of democratic, these more decentralizing credit institutions, had many problems that limited their democratic reach. So money pooled in New England, for example, using these banks as the instruments of choice for money creation, Rhode Island had $77.16 cash per capita after the Civil War. And Alabama had, guess how much? 13 cents per capita, right? After the war, Massachusetts alone had 5 times the money stock of the entire South, and one town in Connecticut had as much money supply, using these local banks, as the states of Texas, Alabama, North and South Carolina combined. Moreover, banks, commercial banks, tied their lending decisions to calculations of profits made quite narrowly by family loyalty or by short-term, their particular self-interest. Finally, banks took in and still take in significant profits or seigniorage from creating money. So they're lending non-interest-bearing dollars, and they're being paid to lend those dollars, so they're earning on the spread. As money creators, they're earning seigniorage. So imagine another kind of bank. This is Tammy's move, right? Imagine another kind of bank, she would say, a postal bank. Imagine that local communities could put their deposits at the post office, that the post office could get seed money from the regional Federal Reserve, that the post office could get grant money from foundations like Bill Gates, who's a Bezos, the most wealthy in the world, that the postal bank could get money from venture capitalists. Imagine that local communities could elect boards to create the lending rules, right? They could set up, have a board of directors who actually set criteria to support local entrepreneurs, who could award credit competitively to those entrepreneurs and transparently. Imagine that they had a payment system that was supported by the Fed, by the clearinghouse power of the Fed and by its power as lender of last resort. So there's plenty of precedent for such a plan. The land bank, the land banks of the 18th century were something like this. The agrarian crop credit proposals of the late 19th century, the old Lombard banks of the early medieval, of the early modern period, the postal banks of some other countries. The payoff, I should add, the post office has actually made such a proposal, suggesting that it at least provide check cashing and deposit services. So the payoff would be both programmatic and critical. Right? It would be programmatic in the sense that we could see a real democratic design that deepened the link between finance and productivity, that changed the way we currently think about those things. And it would also be critical and in the conceptual level. So it would change the way that we think about finance as something other than the train of kind of high-flying elites. Here, it's actually a commercial enterprise, but not only a commercial enterprise, it's also a public enterprise, engendered, basically directed by people who have a broad set of values that they're furthering. So I would say that something like that would be framed to support productive activity and yet disciplined in ways that really joined public capacity to individuated judgment. So at this point, Tammy would ask the penetrating question. So she would show me what's wrong with this proposal, and then she would also point to its potential. And she would push it forward in a transformative direction. And that is why the book is so fantastic, and it's also why we miss her voice so much.
Why don't you let the people, these people have to go to a class.
Oh.
So,
I was sure it was me.
yeah, it's not you, so
Right.
the reason why you shouldn't pause while they read.
I'll go ahead and do that. I'll pause. Thanks. Just going to wait for a moment until the transition is complete, or almost complete. All right, I'll go ahead and start now. So first, thanks to the library, of course, for hosting this very important occasion, and thanks so much to Chris for having organized it. And thanks also to Roberto for having asked Sanjay and me in the first place to sort of help bring this book to press, and for many other things as well. And of course, thanks to Sanjay, I couldn't have had a more stimulating and just marvelous sort of collaborator with Roberto in putting the book together, or sort of finishing with the editing and recommending of the book. So I want to say just a few things first about Tammy as a person, and then a few things about Tammy as a thinker. That's, of course, an artificial distinction, but I guess I'll simply, I'm emphasizing the sort of personal attributes first, and then moving to the more intellectual attributes. So to begin in talking a little bit about Tammy as a person, I'm going to open with maybe three mysteries, and how Tammy was sort of the solution, in a sense, or the answer to these mysteries. So about 14 years ago, I was doing doctoral work at another school, and my principal supervisor was a finance prof, Bob Schiller. But as you know, Bob is something of a visionary where finance is concerned. But I was, I suppose, well-read enough or well-educated enough to know that there were much more visionary folk even than Bob. And one of them, of course, was Roberto. So shortly, sort of toward the end of my last year studying with Bob, I started TFing for Roberto. And I TF'd for him with a couple of very close friends who were also alums of Harvard. And several mysteries sort of emerged during the course of this sort of involvement with Roberto. The first had to do with a distinction that Roberto is sort of well known, I think, for drawing. So oftentimes when Roberto gives a talk, students will sort of ask for more detail, and Roberto's answer will often be, well, what I'm giving you isn't a blueprint, it's a direction, right? One time in a chat after class, I was talking with Roberto, and I said, well, it seems to me there's a lot of space between blueprints and directions, and my guess is a lot of value could be added, so to speak, if there were somebody out there who fully understood the direction and indeed maybe even contributed to forging the direction, but who was also maybe filling in some of the space between blueprints and directions. And Roberto sort of gave me this kind of knowing, he sort of chuckled as though I were sort of naive. There was something he knew that I didn't. And I wondered what this was that he knew that I didn't. So that's mystery number one. The second mystery was that Roberto clearly knew a lot about finance. We talked a lot during that TFing period, but it wasn't, technically speaking, his field. It wasn't something he was teaching, but he seemed to be very well informed on matters financial, and his vision, his sort of directional vision, seemed to involve finance a great deal, and financial institutions and the potential of financial institutions. And I thought, well, where did he get this, right? I mean, clearly Roberto's very well read, but he didn't seem to be somebody who was reading all the finance texts, and yet he seemed quite well informed. And I wondered how that could be. So that was mystery number two. Mystery number three actually emerged from conversations among myself and my friends who were, again, co-TFing for Roberto at this time. We would talk about Roberto. Of course, a very sort of forceful personality. You don't forget Roberto when you meet him. And so we would sort of wonder, in our more sort of gossipy moments, what kind of person could marry Roberto? Because we understood that he had a wife and that he had children, right? That he had a life partner. And we thought, who could actually stand up to this sort of Titanic personality without cringing or shrinking or dissipating or dissolving? That was mystery number three. As it happened, all three mysteries were solved in one evening, and it all happened, I believe it would have been March of 2004, when Roberto invited the lot of us to join him and Tammy for dinner. So we went over to the house, and there was the answer to all three mysteries. There was this absolutely, utterly remarkable person who was sharing the house with Roberto. I would have loved to have met the offspring at that time, but I think they were busy doing their homework or something. So we spent the evening with Roberto and Tammy. And Tammy was absolutely, again, just sort of flabbergasting as a personality. I mean, she was clearly brilliant, just an unbelievably, an ingenious intellect on the one hand, at the same time, very well informed in a kind of empirical, maybe actually a more practical, in the sense of she's somebody who was a practitioner about matters financial. And she was very, I'll use a word that's a little bit reminiscent of the word that Duncan used, but it's just not quite the same word. I'm going to say irreverent. She wasn't overawed by Roberto. She clearly respected him, but he was just as fitting a target of her barbed wit as anybody else. And we all, of course, got a big kick out of that. We thought, all right, well, there's the kind of person who could sort of stand with Roberto. So maybe needless to say, thereafter, a rather deep and lively friendship developed between Tammy and myself that was independent of, even if operating sort of in parallel, with my friendship with Roberto. And the reason was fairly clear. I mean, Tammy was a financier. She was an investment banker at the same time that she was teaching over at Columbia. And that, of course, had her in New York a great deal. I was in New York a great deal shortly thereafter, working over at the New York Fed. And so Tammy and I would meet quite regularly in New York because she worked there quite regularly herself. As I recall, she and Roberto actually had a place in New York, and she would sometimes be staying there. So we would meet up in New York and talk about matters financial. And we would talk about matters financial on the one hand from a sort of theoretical point of view, in the way that Roberto and Tammy and I might have spoken. But on the other hand, also highly practical, again, because she was so well informed, had done so much in the way of investment banking. And so I suppose we sort of cross-pollinated, although I think that probably the pollination moved primarily in the direction of Tammy to me. I learned a great deal from Tammy through this sort of ongoing interlocutory friendship. And at the same time, I felt like I had a sort of ally, a really close friend in the city when I was working there. Now, ever after this point, there were a couple of attributes about Tammy that sort of became even more pronounced, you might say, over time. The first that I always remember is the expression on her face that seemed the perfect complement to her voice and the way that she would intervene in conversations and discussions. I think of it as a sort of fusion or something in the sort of margins or intersection between quizzical on the one hand, astonished on the other hand, and then finally sardonic on yet another hand. There was a kind of an ironical, sort of skeptical cast to her look, to the expression on her face, when she would hear things that were said by orthodox economists or orthodox financiers, or by lawyers who weren't really fully cognizant of the role that their discipline plays in constituting a financial system or an economy, or even money itself for that matter, let alone all of the other kinds of financial instruments that circulate out there. Tammy came to multiple events that I was a part of, sometimes at my invitation, other times at my importunment, other times on her own, just quite spontaneously. I still remember very well a World Economic Roundtable conference in New York back in 2011 in connection with a paper that Nouriel Rabini and I had put out that had gotten a fair bit of attention. So there was a big sort of talk about this, a big conference around it, and Tammy came, and I thought, this is the only person in the room who I actually sort of think like, who's sort of truly an intellectual ally, in addition to just a dear friend. Later, there was a liquidity conference here at Harvard that Chris organized, and there were a lot of very interesting people there, in particular a lot of very important exponents of the MMT movement, but also a number of post-Keynesians and Lerner functional finance folk there. And Tammy and I think were both quite intrigued by and were taking in much that was offered by these different schools of thought, but at the same time sort of trying to retain a certain degree of distance so as to be able to kind of synthesize all that we were sort of taking in. Tammy, I always got the impression throughout that entire event, already knew all of this stuff that was being talked about at Chris's conference. I, for my part, however, was learning a great deal more. So I thought, okay, I've got to hang around with Tammy even more. So I could sort of go on and on with examples like this. The last one maybe would be a conference that Roy Kreitner over at Tel Aviv and I organized called Law, Economy, and Equality, sort of occasioned by the Piketty book. We had a number of very interesting participants, speakers there, but Tammy was by far the showstopper. And what was sort of interesting was this was actually the first hint, I think, to me at least, that there might be a bit of a health challenge to Tammy. And so I want to say something about the kind of heroism of Tammy in this connection as well. So at this conference, we held it in New York. She was to be there like everybody else. In the end, she wasn't able to come in person, but she insisted that we beam her in, so to speak, virtually. So there's a large screen about the size of this, and Tammy was participating throughout the entirety of the conference, but as a large face right here, sort of looming over the entire room. And here was a case in which Tammy filled the room not only with her intellect, and not only with her active interventions, but also with her sort of constant visual presence, sort of presiding over all of us. And while in some cases that might have been thought sort of comical, this seemed somehow fitting. She was clearly the towering intellect in the room, and so it seemed to make sense that she would sort of be there on the wall, sort of watching over all of us. The next thing I want to say is just a little bit about Tammy, when I'm, again, under the heading of Tammy as a person. As I want to emphasize how warm a personality she was, too, just how loving and caring a person she was. You might think at this point, given what I've said thus far, that she's a kind of I don't know, sort of an intimidating and sort of ominous figure, which she certainly could be when she was intellectually engaged, when she was in the midst of a discussion or an argument, even in the midst of certain conversations. I mean, she could be a very forceful personality that I suspect could have bowled over any number of people, but that might give the wrong, if I left you with just that impression, that would be an inaccurate impression. She was one of the warmest and sweetest and most caring people I think I've ever met. She was, I hope this doesn't sound too sexist, but she was maternal at the same time that she was clearly a towering intellect and a passionate practitioner of what we might think of as egalitarian finance or progressive finance. I can't tell you how many times we would talk on the phone or meet for dinner over in New York, walking around Wall Street, where the first questions were always how I'm doing, how am I faring? Am I getting enough rest? Am I eating properly? And she always asked these questions not in a kind of perfunctory way, not as if she was sort of trying to get that business out of the way before getting on to what's important. It was clear that this was at least as important to her, as was whatever subject we were going to talk about by way of theory or practice. Just an unbelievably comforting presence. And her voice, even over the telephone, could be so soothing. She would sense if you yourself were stressed or a little bit sort of maybe burning the candle at both ends, as they say. She could sense it even if you didn't say anything about it, and she immediately sort of zeroed in on that and insisted that you do something about making sure that you're on a sort of even keel, biologically even, just sort of physiologically, so as, I mean, first of all, just because that's important in its own right, but second, because you really can't be a helpful contributor to the world if you're not. So that's sort of Tammy the person, or at least those are the traits that I would want to, I think, emphasize most, and those are the traits that I keep remembering, and those are sort of what come to mind whenever I imagine that sort of, that expression on her face between sort of warm, quizzical, astonished, incredulous, and what have you. And I still actually resort to visualizing that face even to this day, particularly when things are getting a bit stressful out there in the world of finance. Okay, now a little bit more about Tammy as a thinker, which again is sort of artificially distinguished from her as a person because her person came through so vividly in all of her thinking and in all of her advocacy of the views that she took. But nevertheless, just to focus a little bit on what she emphasized, Tammy, I believe, is the founder of an entire school of thought in the realm of finance, if not also in the realm of the law. And yet, ironically, she's perhaps the only one who isn't regularly named yet. That's going to change now that the book is out, when people talk in terms of this particular school of thought. So the school of thought I'm referencing is something that's come to be called the legal theory of finance, right? And there are a number of purveyors of this view, a number of papers sort of setting forth this view that are treated as sort of canonical now out there. The basic idea behind the view is that finance is legally constructed, which on the face of it, if you say it just that way, it sounds sort of trivial. But more importantly, if you elaborate the idea, if you elaborate what it is to say that finance or the financial system is legally constructed, it becomes, things become quickly much more rich, and the significance of the view becomes much more apparent as one elaborates the detail. So as Tammy would have been among the first to point out, if not the first to point out or to emphasize in the current environment, all of the instruments, all of the financial instruments that are circulating in a financial system are legal instruments. Indeed, they're all contracts of one kind or another. They circulate pursuant to particular rules or norms or standards of law that are themselves constitutive of the financial system, including such familiar phenomena as negotiability, the negotiability that you find in the case of negotiable instruments. So the sense in which, and of course money as well, as Chris pointed out a moment ago, if you take out a dollar bill or a $5 bill and you look across the top of the bill, it'll read Federal Reserve Note. Those who are lawyers understand that note here isn't like note to your girlfriend or note to your boyfriend. It's promissory note. It's short for promissory note. That, of course, is a legal instrument. And Tammy, of course, was sort of stunned that ordinary financiers, and indeed many ordinary lawyers, didn't seem to grasp this or didn't seem to understand the deep-running significance of these readily observable facts. Now, it's an oft, I think, sort of stated or specified trait of genius or brilliance that somebody sees what everybody else sees, but sees a significance to it that nobody else sees, right? Sees something that everybody else sort of takes for granted or views as sort of trivial, and understands that there's a sort of a deeper and far more sort of systematic, a much more pervasive significance that this commonly overlooked or sort of dully looked at fact has. And that was Tammy. What she drew from these observations on her part was that the financial system as a whole, including, not just as a whole, but including all the parts thereof and the interactions of the parts thereof, are all legal creations or legal constructions. And in that sense, they're all political creations or political constructions. That's to say that they are our product, right? We make them, right? The so-called invisible hand isn't really invisible at all. If you actually look a little bit more carefully, it's our hand. And we can either use that hand in a manner that's sort of in keeping with our own intentions, our own aspirations, our own dreams and wishes and ideals, or we can pretend that it's somebody else's hand, that it's essentially a kind of, I suppose, a drunken and arbitrarily acting parent. We can treat it that way, or we can treat it as ours, and we can act accordingly. That's the sort of overriding, or you might say that the sort of animating vision that pervades Tammy's thought. But then, of course, things go a lot farther than that. I think maybe the most important insight that you find in Tammy's thinking and in her writing is that finance isn't really just about recycling savings, right? Now, one can sort of say that, right? There's a sense in which it's true. Marx suggested something along these lines. It's true that finance is about recycling savings, but the key point is it's not about recycling money that people have saved up in banks. It's not about recycling pre-accumulated financial instruments. It's easy to see why that's not the case if you just look at how an actual bank lending transaction works. Chris alluded to this. Banks don't have to have deposits or depositors in order to make loans, in order to make monetized loans that are spendable in dollar-denominated terms. A bank simply extends a loan, right? And it does this, of course, by opening an account for the person to whom it's lending the money, or it credits an account that the person already has, or it provides the person in question with a draft that person can then deposit in an account that he or she has elsewhere. And at that point, money is quote-unquote created, as Chris put it a moment ago. I think of this as essentially not so much the creation of money as the generation of money or the generation of credit money. In effect, private financial institutions, or supposedly private financial institutions like banks, are doing that. They're generating credit, and it's monetizable credit, and that credit is backed up by the United States. Indeed, you can think of, and this is a view that I've developed over the last few years, largely in conjunction with or through ongoing conversation with Tammy, the best way of viewing the financial system, I think, is as a kind of franchise arrangement, whereby the sovereign public is a franchisor. It empowers or authorizes certain privately owned franchisee institutions to purvey what remains ultimately a public resource, which is the monetized full faith and credit of the sovereign, in this case, the United States. Usually it does so through a monetary authority or a central bank. In this case, we do that through the Fed. Now, in that sense, if we're thinking in terms of sort of credit money, there's nothing that's being recycled at all, right? It's being generated and distributed. And the idea here is we're sort of outsourcing the task of determining to whom to allocate that resource to private institutions, which in theory, because they're sort of on the ground, are better situated to determine what are the better risks, right? Who are the better risks to lend to, or whose proposed projects are the most believable or the most likely to pan out. Now, it's not necessarily the case that private institutions are best at doing that. Sometimes they might be, other times they might not be. Tammy, I think, was spot on in suggesting that lately, in recent decades, they haven't been particularly good at that at all. Indeed, what they've tended to do is to sort of distribute or allocate credit to secondary markets, where essentially people are bidding up the prices of already existing assets, rather than directing credit in directions where more new productive investment, new real economic growth, new real employment, new real bettering of our material circumstances can happen. Okay, I think that's exactly right, and that's exactly what how Tammy would have put it, more or less exactly. The second thing to say in this connection is that it is nevertheless the case that there is a kind of recycling going on, and here I think I'm getting to what Mark was saying, and that is that you are indeed, through a financial system, recycling pre-accumulated resources, but you're not recycling pre-accumulated funds or pre-accumulated money or pre-accumulated credit. What you're doing is you are recycling, or you are determining the distribution of claims on those resources. And monetary instruments, credit instruments are all claims on such resources. So in effect, what you're doing when you distribute credit in one way or another is you're redistributing, or you're allocating claims on pre-accumulated resources. And what that means in turn is that how you go about doing that allocating is at the very core of what ends up being done with the resources that we already have accumulated, and whether we're redeploying those, again, in sort of fruitful and in sort of material life-improving ways, or if we're doing so simply in ways that generate price inflation within certain speculative markets, in particular the secondary markets. And what that means in turn, then, is that in addition to there being an allocative task on the part of the sovereign when it comes to determining where credit money flows, there's a modulatory task. And indeed, you're not adequately modulating credit aggregates unless you're properly allocating them. And what that means in turn is that when you get the allocation wrong, you're likely to get the modulation wrong. You're likely, in other words, to send too many claims to areas where there's too little resource to sort of be claimed. And that means in turn, you're going to drive up, right, the prices in terms of claims of those particular resources. That's essentially what an asset price bubble is. Tammy understood that better than anybody, and for that very reason, she understood better than anybody, it seemed to me, what had actually happened in the lead up to 2008, and why it was, in consequence, that most of what was happening by way of proposed reform and policy measure after the crash was misguided, was misdirected, because it fundamentally misunderstood what had actually happened. In that sense, you can view the book as Tammy's answer to essentially all of the claims that have been made, all of the speculations that have been made, all of the questions that have been posed after 2008 regarding what went wrong and what should we do. Her answer is basically in the book, and that is to get back to brass tacks, so to speak, to get back to recognition of the fact that the distribution of claims on pre-accumulated resources is itself something that's politically determined, that can be got right or can be got wrong, And we've definitely got it wrong of late, and the only way to get it right is first to recognize that very fact, and then second, to make institutional reforms that will get us to making it right. The reforms are many. I won't enumerate them now, but the book is chock full of them, and so I couldn't possibly recommend the book more highly. And for those of you who knew Tammy, my condolences for all of us for having lost her so early at so early an age. And for those of you who didn't, you'll at least get some flavor of what a truly remarkable intellect and person she was by starting with the book. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I understand we have the room till 1:30, and we're evidently running late. So I'm going to cut my remarks short so that we have some opportunity, at least, for discussion, as opposed to none. I think the case has already been made that the book is a tour de force, and I hope that all of you will accordingly read it, engage with it, draw from it quite deeply. Much of what there is to be said about Tammy as a person, there's of course much more also to be said, has been said, and I don't want to repeat it, much as I might like to reminisce myself about her very unique qualities. I would like to speak to one point, which I must say I have thought quite hard about whether or not to mention, and this concerns the extraordinary coalescence of thought between Roberto and Tammy, which might leave one wondering as to whether they had a joint mind of some kind. This is a subject of interest among philosophers these days, the concept of a collective mind or collective consciousness. Well, it almost seems as if they had such a thing. But of course, the more that I came to know Tammy, and I only came to know Tammy later in my association with Roberto, I came to understand what might already have been drawn to the attention of all of you implicitly by others, that the flow of ideas, at least with respect to economic issues, finance, the productive system, and how to think about these in relation to democracy, was very much, it appears, from Tammy to Roberto. I don't want to, of course, diminish in any way your admiration for Roberto. My admiration is undiminished by this realization. He still, after all, does have some small topics to claim for himself, such as the religion of the future, and a few other such footnotes. But it does stand as a testament to Tammy herself and to the nature of the friendship, as Roberto puts it in his preface, as well as the marriage that they had. One might even refer to this as a kind of a fearful symmetry, which, to echo a phrase in Roberto's Politics, was both great and sweet. Let me, in my role as the only economist on this panel, very briefly refer to three ideas that I think the economics discipline can and should draw from Tammy's work. And by way of pointing to how much the economics discipline has to learn, I will point to some present-day debates or preoccupations of the discipline which stand by way of contrast to the searching as well as wide concerns that Tammy brings to bear in the book. The first of these concerns what we might call the conditions of economic dynamism. Too often in economics, the question of whether or not there is economic progress, whether or not there's innovation, whether or not there is growth, is taken as a kind of a black box, something that somehow or the other emerges. To the extent that there is an attempt to theorize it at all, it's done in a rather simple-minded way by looking at, for example, a country's expenditures on research and development and how they go up and down over time or differ with respect to others. In contrast, in the framework that Tammy brings to bear, the social and institutional organization of economic life is crucial in determining the pace of innovation, of technological progress, and of economic growth. Cooperative competition and the potential public role in facilitating strategic coordination of decentralized actors are crucial in the answer to this question. And this proposal, or this suggestion, this set of observations, in turn draws to our attention the need for a more detailed program of research and investigation that makes the black box much less black. The second concerns the relation between production and distribution. By and large, the economics profession, as it likes to call itself, is preoccupied with distribution as an ex post problem, addressing concerns such as the efficiency, ostensible efficiency of particular modes of taxation, without concerning itself with the question of how the pre-market conditions and the in-market conditions of economic life determine the outcomes that result. Of course, in real economic activity, there is no such thing as pre versus post, because every post is a pre. Economic activity in reality happens in time and is not subject to the abstractions of mainstream economic models. Thomas Piketty's work is an exemplification of this problem. His single-minded focus upon the taxation of wealth as a means of addressing the unprecedented maldistribution in the contemporary world is an example of this narrowness of focus. The silence or the inattention that he and others have by and large shown, though I believe in the recent period he's begun to recognize the need to pay greater heed to this, to institutions and to the broader processes that determine what resources, what skills, what capabilities people bring to bear in the market and on what terms they meet each other, is an illustration of the problem. The third example concerns the relation between regulation and reorganization. By and large, as you know, the debate after 2008 has been concerning the regulation of finance has been focused on a few narrow problems. Whether or not, in the US case, the Glass-Steagall Act should be renewed, the role of the Volcker Rule, macroprudential regulation, and so forth. Central banks, to the extent that they address the question, address it in these terms. The broader set of institutional possibilities that could be imagined, which has already been mentioned by my co-panelists as being envisioned by Tammy, including, for example, such things as public venture capital funds and many other innovative possibilities, is barely recognized. The closest that the debate has perhaps come to opening the broader field of possibilities is in asking the question of whether Main Street rather than Wall Street ought to have been the recipient of bailouts. This, however, as Tammy points out, is merely a starting point for the broader investigation that ought to have taken place and that can still take place. All of this underlines something that both Roberto and Tammy have long emphasized, which is that economics as well as law are subjects which require imagination, institutional imagination in particular, as well as analysis. And too often in the way in which we study these twin subjects of reform and reconstruction, as they refer to them, we focus only on analysis, and we do not focus at all upon imagination. But the powers of imagination are also to be actively cultivated, and of course, harnessed to a concern with humanity, which is amply evident in this book. Thank you.
At this point, we'd like to please raise your hand and we'll pass the microphone to you.
We've worn them out. We could just go on talking. No, we don't want to do that.
I do have good news to tell everyone while you're warming up. The books arrived during the course of the panel discussion, and they're waiting for you right outside the door. So as you exit, please stop by and take a look at the book. It's, as we've mentioned, it's, everyone should want to have a copy at this point, and the COOP is here to supply the books.
Could you outline maybe summarize some short-term and long-term policy prescriptions that are coming out of the book? So things that a 2020 candidate could advocate for, and like 10-year project, but then also what's some 50-year projects coming out of the book, a little bit more practical?
I can speak, at least I'll offer one. It was actually, I think, mentioned by Chris. I thought it was especially important. Tammy advocated the establishment of public venture capital funds, essentially to whereby the public sector itself, would directly invest in what appear to be promising new technologies or promising new, potentially transformative economic developments. She, I think, was remarkably free of this sort of tendency that we tend to have to think that, well, those kinds of decisions are best left solely to the private sector or to private institutions, and that the only role for the public sector is to sort of oversee the sort of broad conduct of finance or sort of policing or making sure that the rules are being followed or what have you. She had a good eye for the many reasons why private sector institutions just might not be up to the task. And so had a refreshing readiness just to say, well, why don't we do direct public venture capital investment? She also, I think, in that connection did something that was very helpful that I've certainly learned from, and that is, she would draw attention to the important role that was played by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, also known as the RFC, in rebuilding the American economy during the 1930s and the 1940s. Partly on the basis of her talk of that institution during our many conversations in the past, I made a sort of major project of sort of researching it, finding out everything I could about it. It's actually a quite remarkable institution. Turns out that during the 1930s and 40s, by far the largest financial institution in the world was the RFC. Its balance sheet utterly dwarfed that of all other Wall Street institutions combined during that period. It made loans as small as $20 to African-American barbershops in Los Angeles, and as large as loans that were quantified up into terms of billions of dollars for large infrastructure projects, including dams, rural electrification, and the like. And we still live with much of the RFC's progeny. Many institutions that you're all familiar with, or at least have heard about, Fannie Mae, for one, the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, for another, the Small Business Administration, SBA, on another, and one could go on and on. There's just many, many progeny of the RFC that are with us to this day. That was proof that the public sector can play a critical role, indeed could play the dominant role in allocating capital under some circumstances much better than private institutions could. I think I would not even have thought of the RFC, might not even have noticed its previous existence. It seems to have vanished so fully from the literature had it not been for Tammy. And many of her proposals, I think, can be thought of as sort of latter-day updated renditions of, or updated latter-day sort of manifestations of that basic animating vision. But the one example, again, that I'll mention here is the one I did before, and that is the idea of, again, publicly started venture capital funds.
Thank you very much for that talk. And it was referred to a bit about cryptocurrency and kind of the movement from gold to now what we are seeing is kind of growing more and more popular, the world of the market of cryptocurrency, which is a lot less limited to single states, and it's a lot more transactions and trades are taking place much more internationally. A lot of the trading sites or options to purchase are coming out of Hong Kong or different areas. So I'm wondering if, looking at legal policing of this financial market, this growing financial market, where would the international oversight or international policing of this market kind of come in within what we talked about today and what Tammy's idea of the ideas were and kind of future policies were?
I'll say one quick thing on that. I suspect Chris has a lot more than I have to say on this. But, you know, I mentioned before, pretty much every day, at least every week, I wish Tammy were still around so that I could sort of bounce an idea off her or chat with her about something. And I think there's probably nothing in connection with which I more wish that Tammy were around right now than the sudden rage with cryptocurrencies. I mean, I would just love to see that sort of, that sardonic, sort of skeptical, quizzical look on her face while listening to some of the nonsense that we're hearing from some of what I guess I think of them as sort of crypto utopians. So I think, and again, this is a sort of WWTS, right? What would Tammy say? I think, you know, when I think about what Tammy would probably say or what she would have to say about cryptocurrencies, would maybe be two things. This is what I would imagine. First, she might say, well, okay, look, we have to distinguish between cryptocurrencies on the one hand and fintech on the other, right? Sort of new modes of money creating or money generating or money distributing or what have you. And I think she would probably find the sort of democratic or democratization potential in some of the new fintech developments to be interesting and promising. I think by the same token, she would have slapped her thigh and guffawed with a roar at some of the claims that people are making to the effect that, well, all of this is going to make the public sector obsolete, or it's going to make central banks obsolete, or it's going to make currency values somehow more stable because it's just like returning to gold, or any of that sort of rubbish. I think she would just have no truck with that and would laugh heartily at it. My guess would be that she would probably ultimately have a view like the following, which is that eventually these technologies will all be commandeered by central banks or monetary authorities, just as every previous new development in financial technology has been commandeered by central banks or monetary authorities. If those central banks or monetary authorities who commandeer these technologies are operating pursuant to a democratic vision, to a sort of a deeply democratizing vision for the economy as a whole, which is the view that Tammy wished that they would hold, I think then all of the new technologies that they commandeer would be put to good use and indeed might even serve as a kind of substitute for postal banking or the like. I mean, you might have telephone banking, for example. I mean, there's a lot of course, kind of banking. There's a lot of access to credit, you might say, and access to certain kinds of banking services that's beginning to come online in previously isolated areas on other continents of the globe, thanks to these technologies. But that only works, you know, it only works to the good of the beneficiaries and to the broader public, if indeed it's a publicly managed or publicly overseen or basically, in the end, politically driven process. And I think that's what she would urge on us right now.
I'm going to say something slightly different that goes in a slightly different way to your question, which I think is fascinating insofar as it takes us directly to the question of law. So I think Tammy would look at cryptocurrencies and look at in many ways, the goal of cryptocurrencies to escape the state and the law. And here, I think she would find it ironic. So the question would be, how long can you escape the law, right? At what point does a dispute within the crypto community need resolution? At that moment, you're back to the law. Right, so part of what's fascinating about Bitcoin are these moments. We studied Bitcoin in a class I had recently, and students had found a case in which the SEC is faced with the question: should they actually prosecute a Ponzi scheme in cryptocurrency? If this is a moment where you come back to the law. If you enforce the scheme, the U.S. government is actually supporting cryptocurrency as something that holds value. If you don't support the scheme, you're allowing people to be bankrupted by their investment. So my point is just that cryptocurrency becomes, in a sense, real and becomes monetary when it asks for enforcement and insofar as it's enforced. And so I think Tammy would tell us to look for those moments in which we're actually constructing value through law enforcement. And until then, we have a really interesting speculative bubble. We have tulips, if you ask me. But it'll be an interesting thing to watch, to see what the SEC does and what people within the cryptocurrency community do.
We're done, right? We're done.
I think we're done. Yeah, I think we should actually stop. So we should stop, but we would love to. We'll be here clustered for a few minutes. So come up and talk to us. We'll liberate people, but we'd love to keep chatting a bit. Thank you.